The air in the grand study crackled with a chilling finality, colder than the October rain lashing against the window panes. Ava Vance stood before him, her hands clasped tightly, a lone, resilient wildflower in a room of imposing oak and faded glory. The man she had married, Duke Daniel Beaumont, looked at her not with the warmth of a husband, but with the detached appraisal of a judge passing sentence. "This arrangement has run its course," he stated, his voice a blade of polished ice. "You have what you came for, and I have a temporary reprieve. Our paths end here." With those words, he shattered the fragile hope she had nurtured in the cold halls of Blackwood Manor, never imagining that he would one day ride through the blackest of nights, through storm and betrayal, just to find the path back to her. The name Daniel Beaumont, the 9th Duke of Blackwood, was a currency of its own. It spoke of ancient lineage of lands that sprawled across 3 counties, and of a power that had once whispered in the ears of kings. But by the autumn of 1888, the name was worth more than the man himself, and infinitely more than the hollowed-out coffers of his estate. Blackwood was dying. A persistent blight had soured the fields the tenants were struggling, and the Beaumont fortune bled dry by his father's gambling, and his grandfather's follies was little more than a memory. Daniel felt the decay in the very stones of the manor. He saw it in the threadbare tapestries, and heard it in the floorboards that groaned like a dying man. At 32 he was handsome, with a severe jawline, and eyes the colour of a winter sky, but a bitter cynicism had carved itself into his features. He was a prisoner of his own legacy, and he was running out of time. The solution, presented by his solicitor, with grim practicality, was as old as the aristocracy itself: marry wealth. The chosen bride was Ava Vance, the only daughter of Baron Vance, a man whose title was barely a footnote in the peerage, but whose fortune, amassed through shrewd investments in shipping and railways, was insultingly robust. Ava was not a celebrated beauty of the London season. She was 24, considered quiet and bookish, with intelligent hazel eyes, and a cascade of brown hair she often wore in a simple, unadorned style. She was in the cold calculus of the marriage market, a commodity. Her father would gain the prestige of a ducal son-in-law, and Daniel would gain the funds to save Blackwood. Their wedding was a stark, joyless affair. Daniel was a pillar of cold courtesy, his vows clipped and precise. Ava, standing beside him in a gown of modest cream silk, was a study in quiet composure, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She knew why he was marrying her. She had overheard the whisper, seen the pitying looks. She was the country mouse with a fat dowry purchased to save the proud Blackwood lion. Life at Blackwood Manor was as she had expected, and worse. Daniel was a ghost in his own home. He spent his days locked in the study, poring over ledgers that only told a story of despair, or riding out across the blighted fields, his shoulders tense with a fury he never expressed. He treated her with a flawless, impenetrable politeness that was more wounding than any overt cruelty. He called her Madam, never Ava. They took their meals in a cavernous dining hall, the silence between them so profound she could hear the ticking of the mantel clock as it marked the slow death of her hopes. Ava was not a fool. She had not expected a love match, but she had hoped for a partnership, a chance to build something new from the ruins of his pride and her fortune. She saw the potential in Blackwood. Walking the grounds, she noticed things Daniel in his despair had overlooked. The blight was not uniform. It seemed to follow the waterways. The soil in the north pasture was acidic, while the south was overly alkaline. She had spent her life studying botany not as a hobby, but as a passion. Her father had dismissed it as an unladylike pastime. But her mother had encouraged it, and Ava's notebooks were filled with detailed observations, sketches, and knowledge of herbal remedies and agricultural science. One evening, desperate to breach the wall between them, she approached him in the library. He was staring into the fire, a glass of brandy in his hand. His expression bleak. "Your Grace," she began softly. He didn't turn. "Madam, I was walking by the tenant farms today. I spoke with Mr. McGregor. He says the blight is worse near the river bend. I was wondering if anyone has tested the pH of the soil there. It's possible that runoff from the old tannery upstream is altering its composition." Daniel finally turned his head, his grey eyes sweeping over her with a look of weary condescension. "You have been playing the role of Duchess for a fortnight, and you fancy yourself an expert in agriculture?" The dismissal stung, but she held her ground. "I have studied botany for many years. It is more than just arranging flowers. I believe I could help." He gave a short, humourless laugh. "My estate is being managed by the most experienced men in the county. I do not require the speculative advice of an amateur. Your role here, madam, is fulfilled by the signing of the marriage contract and the transfer of funds. I suggest you confine yourself to that role." He turned back to the fire, the conversation brutally terminated. Ava stood for a moment, the blood rushing to her cheeks. It wasn't just his pride. It was a deeper, more personal wound he was nursing. She had heard the servants whisper of it, of Isabel Devereux, the society beauty to whom Daniel had been betrothed years ago. Isabel had broken his heart, jilting him publicly for an elderly, wealthier marquis. The betrayal had turned the once charming young duke into the cold, mistrustful man who now stood before her. He saw all women, Ava realized, through the lens of that one profound humiliation. To him, she was just another transaction, another woman using him for a title, no different from Isabel, who had discarded him for a better one. She retreated from the library, her resolve hardening. He could dismiss her, but she would not be idle. She would not watch Blackwood crumble while she possessed the knowledge to save it. If he would not accept her help as his wife, she would offer it as a silent, invisible partner. She would save his home not for his gratitude, but for the tenants, for the land itself, and for the small, stubborn part of her that refused to be defined by his coldness. Ava began her work in secret. She rose before the dawn, slipping out of the manor, while the morning mist still clung to the fields. Dressed in a simple work dress and sturdy boots, a far cry from the silks and satins expected of a duchess, she took soil samples, sketched the patterns of the blight, and consulted the leather-bound journals she had brought from home. She enlisted the help of Thomas, the aging but sharp-witted head groom, a man who had served the Beaumonts since Daniel was a boy, and whose loyalty was to the estate above all else. Initially wary, Thomas watched as Ava worked with a quiet, focused intensity. He saw how she crumbled the soil in her hands, identifying its texture and composition with an expert touch. He listened as she explained her theory about the old tannery and the potential for lime treatments in the acidic northern fields. "The old Duke, he never would have listened," Thomas said one morning, holding a sack open as she deposited a soil sample. "And this one? He's got his father's pride and a hurt that's deeper than any well." "He doesn't need to listen," Ava replied, wiping dirt from her brow. "He just needs to see the results. Can you help me acquire a few wagon loads of crushed lime?" Thomas, without it, appearing on the estate ledgers. Thomas gave a slow nod, a spark of respect in his old eyes. "Leave it to me, Your Grace." Using her own personal allowance, Ava funded the experiment. Under her direction, Thomas and a few trusted farmhands began treating a small, isolated section of a barley field. It was slow, back-breaking work done in the quiet hours when the Duke was preoccupied. Meanwhile, Daniel was grappling with his own demons. The injection of Ava's dowry was a temporary salve, not a cure. It paid off the most pressing debts, but it couldn't make the land yield. His days were a frustrating cycle of meetings with his land agent, who offered no new solutions, and long solitary rides, where every dying stalk of wheat felt like a personal failure. He couldn't deny that his wife was different from what he'd expected. He had anticipated a simpering, vapid girl obsessed with London fashions and eager to flaunt her new title. Instead, Ava was reserved, intelligent, and possessed a dignity that unnerved him. He would catch glimpses of her from his study window, walking the grounds, not with the aimless pace of a lady of leisure, but with a purpose that intrigued him. He saw her speaking with tenants, not with condescension, but with genuine interest. He found one of her botanical journals left in the library, and though he snapped it shut after a moment, he couldn't forget the intricate, skilled drawings of plant roots and cell structures. A part of him, a part he viciously suppressed, was drawn to her. One evening she was in the music room, softly playing a melancholic piece on the pianoforte. He stood in the shadows of the doorway listening. The music was complex and beautiful, filled with a longing that echoed his own. When she finished the final note, hanging in the air, he felt an unfamiliar urge to go to her, to speak, to break the suffocating silence between them. But then, the memory of Isabel would surface, Isabel, who had played this very pianoforte, who had filled these halls with laughter before shattering his trust. He saw Ava's dowry as a cage, another gilded trap. He convinced himself her quiet diligence was a performance, a clever ruse to win his confidence before revealing her true, grasping nature. His paranoia was a fertile ground for the poison that was about to be dripped into his ear. That poison came in the form of Lord Marcus Harrington, a neighbouring landowner whose family had been rivals of the Beaumonts for centuries. Harrington was a man of superficial charm and deep-seated envy. He coveted Blackwood's land and despised the Beaumont title. He had watched Daniel's decline with smug satisfaction and was infuriated by the Duke's sudden financial rescue through his marriage. Harrington began visiting Blackwood under the guise of neighbourly concern. "Daniel, my dear fellow," he'd say, clapping him on the shoulder. "Good to see things are stabilizing. A clever match you've made. Baron Vance's daughter. They say the man could turn lead into gold." Daniel's jaw would tighten. "My marriage is a private matter." Of course, Harrington said smoothly, accepting a glass of sherry. "But one hears things. They say the Baron drove a hard bargain. And the daughter, she is said to be as astute as her father. Keeping a close eye on her investment, I imagine the insinuation was clear. Ava was not a wife, but a financial warden." During another visit, Harrington steered the conversation with calculated precision. "Saw your Duchess out near the old tannery ruins this morning. Quite the explorer. Had her head together with one of your grooms, deep in conversation. One admires a woman who takes such a detailed interest in her husband's assets." Daniel's mind flashed to the conversation. He had dismissed the one where Ava had mentioned the tannery. He had seen her as an amateur, but Harrington painted her as something else, a spy for her father, assessing the estate's weaknesses. The seed of suspicion, planted in the soil of his past betrayal, began to germinate. He started watching Ava not with nascent curiosity, but with a cold, accusatory eye. Her early morning walks were no longer innocent. They were clandestine inspections. Her conversations with tenants were not acts of kindness, but intelligence gathering. He felt a bitter, familiar anger rise within him. He had been a fool, once blinded by Isabel's beauty and charm. He would not be a fool again. This quiet, unassuming woman was in her own way just as dangerous. He was convinced she was systematically cataloguing his vulnerabilities reporting back to her father, who was likely waiting for the right moment to foreclose on the unspoken debt between them and seize Blackwood for himself. The glimmer of hope he'd felt, the grudging respect that had begun to form, was extinguished, replaced by the icy certainty of betrayal. Lord Harrington was a patient predator. He saw the flicker of suspicion in Daniel's eyes and knew precisely how to fan it into an inferno. His plan was not merely to sow doubt, but to provide Daniel with concrete, irrefutable proof of Ava's treachery. He knew Daniel's history with Isabel Devereux had left him primed to believe the worst, a wound that had never healed and was now beginning to fester. Harrington hired a man from London, a forger of some skill who could mimic handwriting with uncanny accuracy. He had managed to acquire a sample of Ava's script from a note she had sent to the village vicar regarding a contribution to the harvest festival. The task was simple: to create a series of letters from Ava to her father, Baron Vance. These were not letters to be posted, but letters to be discovered. The forgeries were masterpieces of deceit. They were written on stationery, identical to Ava's, the tone perfectly capturing her intelligent, observant nature, but twisting it into something sinister. One letter detailed the exact state of the tenant farms, noting which were most vulnerable to foreclosure. Another spoke of Daniel's predictable pride and how it made him blind to the true state of his affairs. The most damning passage, meticulously crafted by Harrington, read, "Father the Duke's trust is a fragile thing, but I believe he is beginning to see me as a true partner. He remains unaware of our larger strategy. Once the spring plantings fail, as they inevitably will, he will be desperate. At that point, your offer to assume his outstanding debts in exchange for the Northern Reach titles will seem like a salvation, not the acquisition we have planned from the start." While the forger worked, Harrington continued his visits, each one a subtle turn of the screw. He would mention Baron Vance's recent purchase of a neighboring property, framing it as an aggressive expansion. The man has an appetite for land. One must admit Harrington would muse, swirling his brandy. He's circling Blackwood like a shark. You must be careful, Daniel. Ensure your wife's loyalties lie with you, not her father's ambitions. Daniel, stewing in his own paranoia, began to see confirmation everywhere. He intercepted a genuine letter from Ava to her mother, a simple, lonely note asking for news from home, and read it with a cynic's eye, searching for codes and hidden meanings where there were none. The moment to spring the trap arrived on a Tuesday. Harrington knew Daniel was due to ride to the nearby town of Oakridge to meet with his bankers. He arranged for a messenger to be seen delivering a letter to one of Ava's maids, with instructions for the maid to place it in the Duchess's private writing desk. Harrington's true agent on the inside, however, was not the maid, but a footman named Peter, a disgruntled man whom Harrington had bribed with a significant sum. Peter's job was to ensure the forged letters were planted in a place Daniel was certain to find them. That afternoon, Peter waited until Ava was in the gardens. He slipped into her chambers and carefully placed the bundled forged correspondence at the very bottom of her rosewood writing desk, beneath some spare stationery. He then went to find the Duke. Daniel had just returned from Oakridge, his mood blacker than ever. The bankers had been polite but firm. More collateral was needed, a prospect that was impossible. He was striding down the main corridor when Peter approached him, his face a mask of feigned anxiety. "Your Grace," the footman said, bowing his head. "Forgive me. I was not sure if I should speak, but my conscience compels me." Daniel stopped, his grey eyes narrowing. "Speak then. It is the Duchess, Your Grace." Peter said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "I have seen her on more than one occasion, writing letters. Secret letters. She sends them not by our regular post, but by a private courier who meets her near the old woods. Today I saw a letter delivered for her. I believe she is hiding them." He paused, letting the implication sink in. "In her writing desk, Your Grace, in the main parlour." It was the final devastating piece of the puzzle. The tannery, the private walks, the probing questions, the coded letters. Everything clicked into place, forming a picture of profound betrayal. It was Isabel all over again. But this time, it was not his heart being broken for a richer title, but his entire legacy being dismantled from within by a woman he had allowed into his home. A cold, sharp rage, unlike anything he had felt before, seized him. He did not run. He walked his steps, measured and heavy, to the parlour. The room was empty, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. He went straight to the rosewood desk Ava favoured. His hands did not shake as he opened the drawers. He found her neat stacks of paper, her pots of ink, her botanical sketches, and then at the bottom of the deepest drawer he found them a small bundle of letters tied with a simple blue ribbon. He untied the ribbon and read. Each word was a drop of acid on his soul. The clinical assessment of his finances, the manipulation of his trust, the cold, calculated plan to strip him of his land, and title it was all there in her elegant, familiar script. He saw the phrase, "our larger strategy," and felt a bitter laugh escape his lips. He had almost allowed himself to feel something for this woman. What a pathetic fool he was. He stood there for a long time, the forged letters clutched in his hand, the setting sun painting the room in hues of blood and fire. The quiet, resilient woman he had married was a viper, and he had welcomed her to his hearth. He would not make a scene. He would not rage. He would do what he should have done from the start. He would cut her out of his life with surgical precision, leaving no room for argument or appeal. Ava returned from the West Meadow feeling a nascent sense of triumph. The small experimental patch of barley they had treated with lime was showing undeniable improvement. The yellowing stalks were regaining their colour, standing straighter and stronger than the blighted plants surrounding them. It was working. The discovery filled her with a quiet, fierce joy. For the first time, she felt she was not just the Duchess of Blackwood in name, but a part of its survival, its future. She decided she would finally show Daniel, not with words or theories, but with tangible proof. She would take him to the field herself. She found him in the grand study, the same room where he so often barricaded himself. He was not at his desk, but standing by the tall windows, looking out at the rain that had begun to fall, smearing the twilight. The forged letters were lying on the polished surface of his desk, stark against the dark wood. "Daniel," she said, using his given name for the first time, without the shield of his title. The small victory in the fields had made her bold. "I have something wonderful to show you." "In the West Meadow." He turned slowly. The look on his face stopped her cold. The usual frost in his eyes had hardened into something glacial and absolute. There was no anger, no passion, only a terrifying, empty coldness. "I am quite sure you do," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You have been very busy, haven't you? Cataloguing my assets, assessing my weaknesses." Ava's smile faltered. "I don't understand." "Oh, I think you do." He gestured with his chin toward the desk. "Your correspondence. It seems I have been remiss in appreciating the full scope of your talents." Confused, she walked to the desk and looked down at the letters. She saw her own handwriting, her own stationery. Then she began to read. The world tilted on its axis. The words were a grotesque parody of her thoughts, her private observations twisted into a cold-hearted conspiracy. Our larger strategy. Acquisition we have planned from the start. It was a nightmare. This She whispered, her hand flying to her throat. "This is not real. I never wrote these." "Did you not?" Daniel's voice was laced with a weary, cutting sarcasm. "Spare me the performance, madam. The innocent act wore thin weeks ago. I admit it was skillfully played. The quiet scholar, the concerned wife, a far more subtle approach than my first fiancée, but the goal was the same, wasn't it? A title, an estate, you and your grasping father. Every word was a physical blow. No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "That is not true. My father, we only wanted to help. You have helped enough." He cut in sharply. He crossed the room and stood before her, his height and his cold fury creating an impassable wall. "I was a fool to agree to this arrangement, a fool to believe for a single moment that it could be anything other than a transaction. But the transaction is now complete. Your father's funds have settled my most immediate debts. You have your title. I believe that concludes our business." Tears welled in Ava's eyes, hot and sharp, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him the satisfaction. "Daniel, you must believe me. Someone has done this to us. This is a lie." "The only lie," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "is the one I have been telling myself, that I might eventually be able to trust you." He looked at her, then his gaze sweeping over her as if she were a stranger, an unwelcome intruder in his home. The finality in his eyes was absolute. "Our paths end here," he said, the words as clean and brutal as a headsman's axe. "This arrangement has run its course. I will have my solicitor draw up the annulment papers on the grounds of fraud. You will be escorted back to your father's house in the morning. Take whatever you came with. I want no trace of you left in this house." The world fell away. The hope she had harbored, the small shoots of affection she had begun to feel for this broken, proud man, the future she had envisioned where they might heal Blackwood and each other, it all turned to ash. He believed this monstrous fabrication without a moment's hesitation because his past had already convinced him of her guilt. She was tried and sentenced before she even knew the crime. Her own pride, a force as strong and deep as his, rose to meet his cruelty. She lifted her chin, her gaze locking with his. She would not plead. She would not beg for the belief of a man who thought so little of her. "As you wish, Your Grace," she said, her voice miraculously steady. She turned and walked out of the study, her back straight, her head held high. She did not look back. She did not see him flinch as the door clicked shut, leaving him alone in the growing darkness with the victory he had sought. A victory that felt to his profound and unsettling surprise exactly like defeat. The morning broke grey and damp. A carriage was waiting at the front entrance, an oppressive black lacquered symbol of her exile. Ava's departure was a quiet, clinical affair. The servants under the Duke's strict orders were nowhere to be seen, though she caught a glimpse of Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, watching from an upstairs window, a handkerchief pressed to her lips. Thomas, the old groom, stood by the horses, his face a grim mask of misery. He met her eyes and gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, a final silent acknowledgement of their shared secret work. Ava did not look at the manor as the carriage pulled away. She kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead, a path leading away from the wreckage of her marriage. She felt a grief so profound it was a physical ache in her chest, but beneath it lay a sliver of indignation that was as hard and sharp as flint. He had not just misjudged her. He had erased her. Back at Blackwood, an unnerving silence descended. Daniel had expected to feel relief, a sense of liberation. Instead, the manor felt vast and empty, the silence accusing. He had purged the viper from his house, yet he felt no triumph. He threw himself into his work with a feverish intensity, trying to drown out the disquieting echo of her presence. A week passed. The rain continued, and the fields seemed to sink deeper into their blighted slumber. The temporary reprieve her dowry had brought was evaporating, and the problems with the land remained stubborn and mocking. One evening, unable to bear the confines of his study, Daniel found himself wandering the halls. He ended up in the small parlor where she had kept her writing desk. He had ordered her things removed, but the servants, perhaps out of pity, had missed something. Tucked into a corner of a bookshelf was a small, plain-looking journal, bound in green leather. He recognized her neat script on the spine, Botanical Observations, Blackwood Estate. He told himself to burn it, to remove the last vestige of her. But some impulse he couldn't name made him open it instead. He expected to find pressed flowers and sentimental poetry. What he found was a meticulous scientific record of his own failings. Page after page was filled with her elegant handwriting and stunningly detailed drawings. There were sketches of the blighted barley with cross-sections of the roots and notes on cellular decay. There were charts mapping the blight's progression, correlating it with the estate's waterways. There were chemical formulas, soil pH readings, and detailed notes from conversations with his own tenants. Conversations she had apparently understood far better than he. And then he found the final entries. It was her plan. A systematic, brilliant proposal for crop rotation and soil remediation, starting with the application of crushed lime to neutralize the acidic runoff from the old tannery. It was detailed, practical, and backed by pages of research and observation. At the end of the final entry she had written, "The land is not lost. It is only wounded. It can be healed." He sank into a chair, the journal open in his lap. This was not the work of a spy or a saboteur. This was the work of someone who cared, someone who had looked at his dying home and seen not an asset to be stripped, but a life to be saved. The cruel words he had spoken to her in the study, his smug dismissal of her amateur advice, came rushing back to him, searing him with shame. His carefully constructed world of suspicion began to crack. The forged letters on his desk now seemed garish and theatrical compared to the quiet, earnest truth in the journal he held. Could he have been so wrong, so blind? His tormented thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was Mrs. Gable, her face pale with worry. "Your Grace," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I must speak with you. I know you gave orders, but my conscience will not allow me to stay silent." Daniel looked up, his face ashen. "What is it?" "It's about the footman, Peter, Your Grace." She began, twisting her hands in her apron. "He's gone. Left this morning without a word. But before he left, he was in the village tavern last night, drinking heavily and boasting. Said he was coming into a great fortune. Said he'd done a service for Lord Harrington, and was paid more than a year's wages for it." Lord Harrington. The name struck Daniel like a physical blow. Harrington, his concerned neighbor. Harrington, who had been there at every turn, stoking his fears, pointing him toward suspicion, watering the seeds of his own paranoia. "What service?" Daniel asked, his voice a low growl. Mrs. Gable wrung her hands. He said Lord Harrington paid him to place some letters in the Duchess's desk. He was laughing about it, Your Grace. Said the Duke was a proud fool who was easy to lead by the nose, begging your pardon. Said he'd believe anything against his own wife. The cracks in Daniel's world shattered, and the entire edifice of his certainty came crashing down around him. The journal in his hands, the housekeeper's testimony, it was the truth, stark and undeniable. He had been played for a fool, a puppet in his rival's venomous game. He had allowed his own wounded past to be weaponized against him, and in his blind, arrogant pride, he had committed an unforgivable cruelty. He had driven away the one person who had genuinely tried to help him, the woman who held the key to saving his home. The woman who, he realized with a sudden gut-wrenching clarity, he had come to admire, to respect, and perhaps even to love. The emptiness he felt wasn't the absence of a business partner, it was the absence of Ava. The revelation struck Daniel with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He wasn't just wrong, he had been a willing pawn in his own destruction. Harrington's smirking face swam in his vision, the feigned sympathy, the carefully placed words of concern, now revealing their venomous intent. Shame, hot and corrosive, burned through him. He looked down at Ava's journal, at the pages filled with her quiet brilliance and dedication, and felt a self-loathing so profound it threatened to consume him. He dismissed the housekeeper with a strained thanks, and for a moment he simply sat paralyzed by the magnitude of his error. Then a cold, clarifying rage took hold. It was a rage directed not at Ava, but at Harrington, and most of all at himself. He would not wallow in self-pity. He had to know the full extent of the deception. He had to have proof, not just the word of a drunken footman. His first stop was the village. The footman Peter had already vanished likely on the first coach out of the county with Harrington's blood money. But his boasting had left a trail. Daniel, the formidable Duke of Blackwood, personally entered the smoky confines of the village tavern, his presence silencing the room instantly. He questioned the tavern keeper who intimidated and, eager to please, confirmed Mrs. Gable's story and added more details. Peter had bragged about a gentleman from London who had provided the letters a man with ink-stained fingers and a cheap suit. A London forger. Harrington had left nothing to chance. Next, Daniel went to see his own solicitor in Oakridge, not as a client, but as an investigator. He laid out the situation with brutal honesty, omitting none of his own foolishness. The solicitor, a shrewd man named Mr. Davies, listened patiently. "Lord Harrington is as cunning as he is ambitious," Davies said grimly. "Proving his direct involvement will be difficult. He will have covered his tracks. Then we uncover them," Daniel stated, his voice hard as iron. He dispatched agents to London with a description of the forger and sent riders to the surrounding towns to inquire about any recent large land surveys commissioned by Harrington. He was looking for a motive beyond simple rivalry. While he waited, he began to implement Ava's plan. He took her journal to his skeptical land agent, who read it first with scorn, then with grudging respect, and finally with outright astonishment. "My lord," the agent said, looking up from the pages, This is remarkable. If her theories are correct, this could save us. Wagon-loads of crushed lime, the very thing Ava had secretly purchased, were ordered. Daniel oversaw the work himself, riding out to the fields at dawn and staying until dusk. He worked alongside his tenants, his ducal pride stripped away, replaced by a desperate need for redemption. With every shovelful of soil he turned, he felt a fraction of the weight of his guilt. The land did not judge him. It simply waited. 3 days later, one of his agents returned from London. He had found the forger. The man, a petty criminal named Finch, had panicked when confronted by men working for a duke and confessed everything. He described Harrington's instructions in detail, producing a draft letter. He had kept a damning piece of evidence that perfectly matched the forgeries. The same day, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. The inquiries about land surveys had borne fruit. Harrington had secretly commissioned a geological survey of the northern reach of the Blackwood estate, the very land mentioned in the forged letter. The survey had revealed rich, untapped coal deposits beneath the seemingly worthless, blighted soil. The full, breathtaking scope of Harrington's scheme was now clear. It wasn't just about envy or rivalry. It was about greed. He had planned to ruin Daniel, drive Ava away, and then, with Daniel, at his most desperate swoop-in, and by the northern reach for a pittance, knowing he was sitting on a fortune in coal. Ava's dowry had complicated his plan, so he had adapted, turning her into the enemy, using Daniel's own emotional scars to make him the architect of his own ruin. The final piece of information came from Thomas, the head groom. Seeing the change in the Duke, Thomas finally came forward. He told Daniel about Ava's secret work, how she had used her own allowance to buy the first loads of lime, how she had worked tirelessly, driven by a genuine desire to save the estate. "She's a good woman, Your Grace." The old man finished his voice thick with emotion. "A better duchess than Blackwood has seen in 100 years. And you threw her away like she was nothing." Thomas's words were the final, necessary twist of the knife. Daniel stood in his study, the proofs of Harrington's treachery and Ava's innocence laid out before him. The weight of his colossal mistake was suffocating. He hadn't just lost a partner, he had betrayed and humiliated a woman of incredible strength, intelligence, and integrity. He had allowed his past to poison his present, and in doing so, had nearly destroyed his future. He had to get her back. It was no longer just about saving his estate. It was about saving himself. He summoned Mrs. Gable. Where did she go? When the Duchess left, where was she headed? The housekeeper looked at him, her expression a mixture of pity and hope. She went home to her father, Baron Vance. "Your Grace, but I had a letter from a friend who serves in their house. The Baron and his family are closing up their country home. They're taking a ship to America." America! Daniel felt a cold dread seize him. "Yes, Your Grace. They feel she has been dishonored here, that there is nothing left for her. The ship, the Sea Serpent, it sails from Bristol. At dawn. Tomorrow. Bristol was a full day's ride away, and a wicked storm was brewing in the west, the sky already a bruised purple. He had less than 24 hours to cross the country to find her, and to somehow convince the woman he had so cruelly wronged that his heart was not as blighted as his land. The sky broke open, just as Daniel rode out of the Blackwood gates. Rain came down in blinding wind-driven sheets, turning the roads to mud and the world to a churning grey chaos. He was mounted on Auries, his powerful black stallion, the only horse in his stables with the stamina for such a desperate ride. The storm was a fitting backdrop for the tempest in his soul. Every thunderclap sounded like an accusation, every lash of rain a penance. He pushed the horse mercilessly, his mind a maelstrom of regret, and a single burning imperative: reach Bristol. He pictured Ava on the deck of a ship, her face turned toward a new world, leaving him, and his broken one behind. The image was intolerable. He was no longer the cold, proud Duke. He was just a man stripped of his arrogance, racing against the dawn. As twilight bled into a treacherous, rain-soaked night, he knew he was being followed. He'd caught glimpses of a rider behind him, a shadow that matched his pace, keeping a steady distance. He initially dismissed it as another traveler caught in the storm, but the persistence was unnerving. On a lonely stretch of road flanked by dense forest, the rider made his move. He spurred his horse, closing the distance, and Daniel saw the glint of moonlight on a pistol barrel. It was Lord Harrington. His face was a mask of cold fury, his fine clothes soaked and splattered with mud. Beaumont Harrington shouted over the howl of the wind, "Turn back, you're too late." "It's over, Harrington." Daniel yelled back his hand, instinctively going to the hilt of the riding sword he wore. "I know everything. The forger, the coal survey, everything." Harrington's sneer was visible even in the gloom. "You know nothing. You had it all and you were too blind to see it. That plain little wife of yours would have saved you, and you threw her out. I was merely helping you along your path to ruin. Now she is gone, and Blackwood will be mine." "Never," Daniel snarled. Harrington raised his pistol. "She won't have you. Not after what you did. And you will not reach Bristol to find out. Turn back now, or I'll put a bullet in that magnificent horse of yours and leave you here to rot." Daniel knew Harrington was right about one thing. Ava might never forgive him, but he had to try. In that moment, a lifetime of aristocratic restraint fell away. He let out a raw, furious cry and spurred Ares directly at Harrington's horse. The stallion, sensing his master's intent, reared with a wild scream. Harrington's horse shied violently, and his shot went wide, the muzzle flash a brief, angry spark in the night. The horses collided. Daniel, a superior rider, used the momentum to unseat his rival. Harrington tumbled from his saddle, landing hard in the churning mud. Before he could recover, Daniel was off his horse, sword drawn. "Get up," Daniel commanded, his voice shaking with adrenaline and rage. Harrington scrambled to his feet, drawing his own sword. The rain plastered their hair to their faces as they circled each other, the clash of steel ringing out between claps of thunder. Harrington was a decent fencer, but Daniel was fueled by a desperation that bordered on madness. He fought not with the cold precision of a duel, but with the raw fury of a man fighting for his soul. He drove Harrington back, his blows relentless. He disarmed him with a sharp twist of the wrist, sending Harrington's sword flying into the darkness. He pressed the tip of his own blade to Harrington's throat. "You tried to destroy my home and my life," Daniel said, his voice low and ragged. "For that you will answer to the law. But you made me destroy the best part of it. For that there is no punishment severe enough." He wanted to kill him. The urge was a hot, primal thing. But looking at the pathetic, mud-soaked man shivering before him, he knew it wouldn't change what he had done to Ava. Vengeance was a hollow prize. Redemption was the only thing that mattered. He lowered his sword. "I'm leaving you here. If you have any sense, you'll be gone by morning, because I will send the magistrates for you." Without another word, he remounted Ares and galloped away, leaving Lord Harrington alone and defeated in the mud and the rain. The rest of the ride was a blur of exhaustion and pain. His muscles screamed, his lungs burned, but he did not stop. The name Ava was a rhythm he rode to a prayer against the fading night. As the first pale, watery light of dawn began to stain the eastern sky, he crested a hill and saw it below him, the sprawling port of Bristol, its hundreds of masts, like a skeletal forest against the grey sea. He was running out of time. The Bristol docks were a hive of activity, a chaotic symphony of shouting sailors, rattling chains, and the mournful cries of gulls. The air was thick with the smell of salt tar and wet stone. Daniel, astride his exhausted and mud-caked stallion, was a stark, desperate figure against the backdrop of the orderly departure preparations. He looked wild, his ducal finery torn and filthy, his face streaked with dirt, his eyes hollowed out by a sleepless night of riding and fighting. He scanned the ships, his heart hammering against his ribs. He finally saw it, the Sea Serpent, a grand three-masted vessel, its crew making the final preparations to cast off. Passengers were crowding the gangplank. He urged Ares forward, his voice a hoarse cry. Dumas. He saw her then. She was standing near the base of the gangplank, speaking with her father. She was dressed in a simple but elegant travelling cloak, her face pale but composed. She looked thinner than he remembered, and there was a new, sad wisdom in her eyes. When she heard his voice, she froze. Her head turned, and her eyes widened in disbelief. Daniel practically fell from his saddle, his legs barely able to hold him. He stumbled toward her, pushing past onlookers who stared at the dishevelled nobleman. He stopped a few feet away from her, a chasm of his own making between them. "Ava," he said again, his voice cracking. Baron Vance stepped forward, his face a thundercloud of paternal fury. "Beaumont, you have some nerve showing your face here. You will not harass my daughter further. Be gone." Daniel didn't even look at him. His eyes were locked on Ava's. "Please," he begged, and the word was stripped of all pride, all artifice. It was the sound of a man broken open. "Don't go." Ava's expression was unreadable. The shock had been replaced by a guarded stillness. "You made your wishes perfectly clear, Your Grace," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Our paths end here," you said. "I was a fool," he confessed, taking a hesitant step closer. "A blind, arrogant fool. I was wrong. About everything." He pulled her journal from inside his coat. It was warped and stained from the rain, but intact. He held it out to her. I found this. Ava, you were trying to save Blackwood, all along. While I was accusing you, you were working to save my home." He poured out the whole story, Harrington's deception, the forged letters, the coal survey, the duel in the rain. He didn't make excuses for himself. He owned his suspicion, his cruelty, his prideful blindness rooted in his past. "I let what Isabel did to me poison everything," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I saw betrayal where there was only loyalty. I saw conspiracy where there was only brilliance. I didn't just fail you as a husband, Ava. I failed you as a human being. I looked at the most honest, intelligent, and honorable person I have ever known, and I called her a liar." Tears were now streaming down his face, mingling with the rain and dirt. He didn't bother to wipe them away. "I did not ride through the night to save my estate. The work you started is already doing that. I rode for you, because a Blackwood without you is just a pile of stones and dying fields. It's not a home. You are its heart. I love you, Ava. I know I have no right to say it, and even less right to ask you to believe it. But it is the truest thing I have ever known." He fell to his knees before her, on the wet, grimy cobblestones of the docks, the great Duke of Blackwood, kneeling to the wife he had cast out. "I am not asking you to return as my Duchess." He whispered, his head bowed. "I am begging you to come back as my partner, my equal, my wife. Teach me how to heal the land. Teach me how to be a man worthy of you, or if you cannot, just allow me to spend the rest of my life trying to atone for what I did." The docks had fallen silent around them. Ava looked down at the man kneeling at her feet. She saw not the cold duke who had dismissed her, but a man stripped bare his vulnerability, a testament to the profound change within him. She saw the rain-soaked journal, the symbol of her secret work, now held by him as a sacred text. Her heart, which she thought had been shattered beyond repair, ached with a terrible, beautiful pain. Her father touched her arm. "Ava, the ship is leaving." She looked from her father to the ship and then back to Daniel. She could sail away to a new life, free of the ghosts of Blackwood. Or she could take the hand of this broken, redeemed man and walk a new path with him, one they would have to build together from the ruins of the old one. Slowly she reached out and laid her hand on his bowed head. He looked up, his eyes filled with a desperate, fragile hope. "Get up, Daniel," she said softly, her voice catching. "We have fields to plant." A sob of pure relief escaped him. He rose and took her hand, clinging to it, as if it were his only anchor in the world. Together they turned their backs on the ship sailing for a new world, and began the long journey home, not to the past that had nearly destroyed them, but to the future they would now finally build together. And so the Duke and his Duchess returned not to a house of cold obligation, but to a home awaiting its heart. Their journey was far from over. Trust, like the blighted fields of Blackwood, would need time, patience, and careful nurturing to flourish again. But for the first time, they were walking the path together, partners in healing the land and each other. Theirs is a story that reminds us that pride can build the highest walls, but love, honesty, and a willingness to admit when we are wrong possess the power to tear them down. It teaches us that sometimes the most desperate journey is not across a storm-swept country, but across the few feet of distance to a heart we have wronged. If their story of redemption and second chances touched your heart, please take a moment to hit the like button and share it with someone who loves a story of love against all odds. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more dramatic tales of history heartache and the enduring power of forgiveness. We love hearing from you, so please leave a comment below and let us know your favorite part of Daniel and Ava's story. Thank you for listening.